When we talk about map algebra, what we're talking about is a cell by cell combination of raster data layers. So this really feeds right into raster analysis. In this example here, we can see one thing that's important to consider in map algebra and raster analysis, and that is that the grids have to be compatible. If we have grids of different sizes, such as layer 1 and layer 2 in this example, and if the grid cells, that will mean the grid cells are of different sizes, but also they're offset from each other. It's not even like 4 grid cells from layer 2 fit into one grid cell of layer 1. They're offset, the grid cells are offset, and they're different sizes, and all of this leads to the fact that we have to resample one of these grids to fit with the other before we can do any sort of raster analysis. With raster analysis, we're always assuming one grid cell lines up with another grid cell in a different layer in order for the analysis to take place. With map algebra, we can have unary operations or binary operations. With unary operations, we have one input layer and one output layer. In this example, in the left column, we can see that we're taking an input raster layer. The raster is represented by the grid, and each one of the numbers inside of the grid represents the grid cell's value. And then in this case, we're just multiplying by 2. So it's a mathematical operation, and the example shown is 3 times 2 equals 6, so that's what's entered into the new output layer. So we're actually creating a new output layer with this process, but we only need one layer as input. This is different than a binary operation, which is most of the types of raster analysis that goes on, where we have layer A and layer B, and we're combining them in some way. In this example here, we're adding layer A and layer B in order to get the sum layer at the bottom of the right-hand column, and we can see that with the circled examples, 2 plus 1 is going to equal 3. When would we use these? Well, a unary operation, one simple example would be if we had a digital elevation model that was in feet and we wanted to convert it to meters. We would just do one mathematical operation where we multiply by a constant to get from feet to meters. For the binary operations, this might be how susceptible an area is to natural disaster, and if we're measuring susceptibility based on different layers, such as if we're looking at landslides and where there might be a certain type of soil and where there might be slopes of a certain degree, then those two combined would tell us how susceptible the area was to landslides in the sum layer. Just as an overview of what we're going to be looking at here, there are different types of functions that we can apply to raster. One is called a local function, and that's what was just shown in the previous example. We can see there's a unary operation in the upper right going on there. We're taking a grid, we're adding 4 to it, and we're coming up with a new grid. Another type of function that we use is called a neighborhood function. Here we're looking at a central grid cell, represented in black, and all of the adjacent grid cells, whether they touch along an edge or just on one point in a corner, and they're highlighted in gray here. And we might take all of those values and come up with a new value for that grid cell in a new grid layer based on what those values are. One example here would be calculating slope, when we not only need to know the elevation value of the central grid cell, but we need to know what the elevation values are of the surrounding grid cell. One that's left out of this figure, but we'll talk about, are zonal functions. And with zonal functions, we're looking at how a grid varies based on another grid or vector layer that we're putting on top of that. So each one of the different colors on the left could represent a different vector layer, and each of the grid cells in there could be summarized. An underlying grid, such as land use, could be summarized based on what's inside of the orange, green, and yellow areas. And the last type of function is a global function, where we account for all of the grid cells in the entire grid in order to calculate a new value for the output grid. In this example here, they're using a global maximum. So whatever the maximum value is in all of the gray grid cells in the top grid, and including the black grid cell, That's what would be assigned to that new black grid cell on the bottom. And in the example shown in the textbook, this is the same for the entire output layer.